Welcome to Lecture 1 of Chapter 6, which focuses on family law and policy. So, what does Chapter 6 cover? Well, it looks at laws and policies associated with the family. And so it looks at laws and policies associated with marriage, divorce, parental rights and responsibility. And when it comes to parental rights and responsibilities, the textbook examines those rights and responsibilities both in marriage and outside of marriage. And, as we'll look at in the next set of lecture slides, it places it all in historic context. And it also shows sort of the role that feminism played in defining and redefining marriage, divorce, and parental rights and responsibilities. And I do want you to note that this textbook was written before Obergefell v. Hodges. And that's the landmark case that says that same-sex couples have the constitutional right to marry. So you will notice in the textbook that it references marriage outside of legal rights. And I know that you know this, but I just wanted to clarify that the textbook is outdated in this way, and I wanted to draw your attention to it. So, why study family law and policy in a class like this? Well, it goes without saying that when it comes to sex, power, and public policy, a lot of power and is plays itself out in family, marriage, divorce, and child custody laws. And so it's a great opportunity to sort of see the way that gender norms, expectations, and stereotypes play themselves out in law and actually for quite some period of time. Now, a lot of you probably aren't thinking about marriage right now because you're youngins and it may not be at the forefront of your minds. However, studying it can really give you some interesting insight into family law and policy, even if it's not something that you see ever in your future, or if you don't see it in your future for quite some period of time. That studying family law and policy can give you a deeper understanding of your own life, your past, present, and future, because most of us, not all of us, are a product of a marriage. And so understanding the law can kind of give you an understanding of some of the forces that were governing over your parents at the time. It really can give you just a deeper understanding of gender norms and values. And quite frankly, as I was rereading the chapter, my second wave feminist sort of spirit was rising up because I was looking at sort of the way in which unity, coverture, that phase that you learn about in your textbook about where a woman is subsumed into her husband's legal identity and how long lasting that impact was. I'm married, and it kind of made me wonder, why the hell did I ever get married, given that sort of that history. So we've come and changed. Marriage has changed a lot, but just seeing how long lasting that sort of viewpoint was, and that theory of understanding marriage was a little bit chilling. And so it's interesting because we can get these broader insights into those stereotypes and norms. Uh, we also get knowledge of the changing status of marriage. And I know we were supposed to do the discussion, the extra credit assumption about single nation, and we are still going to do it. I'm just postponing it for a little bit since we've kind of had a lot of work that's you guys have been doing recently. So we'll do it later, but we'll also see how, changing status of marriage and how people are really waiting to get married, and also people are choosing to never get married, and the implications that has for society. And you can also see sort of the complexities of feminism through studying family law and policy. Because, like many of the things we're studying this semester, there's no single feminist position. Feminists took very different views towards divorce policy and child custody policy, and even whether or not a woman who's truly a feminist should even get married, because they sort of see it as a patriarchal system. And so it gives us insight into just how feminism is not this monolithic ideology, and just how complex it's been and for such a long period of time. Studying family law and policy it's a challenge to study, and this is not unique to family law. We're going to see this when we get to our chapter on sexual assault law, that it's hard to it's challenging to study for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons is because of federalism. Um, so federalism is the power sharing relationship between the national government and the state governments. And certain sorts of powers have been reserved to the states. And they're seen as areas where the federal government doesn't generally get involved. And those are known as the police powers. They're also known as the reserved powers because the 10th Amendment tells us that certain kinds of powers that have not been given to the Congress shall be reserved to the states. And the police powers cover laws having to do with marriage and family. And so it's challenging to study because every state, and you see this in the chapter, every state has a different policy. There's not a national policy that governs over family law, marriage law, adoption law, etc., divorce law. It's different state by state. So it can be very challenging. And not only that, it's challenging because if you want to have more of a uniform understanding of marriage, one that is more equitable, that's not likely to take place at the national level. So, if you're going to make those changes, you have to sort of have those changes be recommended by legal associations, which you'll see in the textbook they try to do, but it just makes it challenging to study and also to change policy. Another reason it's challenging is because of the common law tradition. And so federalism, leaves the decisions to the states. And a lot of times the states would just look at how the courts have dealt with marriage and division of property and divorce and custody of children. And they would just look at how the courts have dealt with it in the past, and they would just implement that for how to resolve a dispute in the present time. And so common law tradition plays a big role in family law, and again, making it sort of frustrating, particularly if you're wanting to see some more substantial changes and how difficult it is to get those changes. It's difficult to attract changes because states are making these changes state by state, and there's no federal sort of law governing it. It's sort of difficult to figure out. There's a lot of work that goes into figuring out like who gets custody and custody disputes, or how our state's different when it comes to property ownership once one gets married. So tracking changes is complex. And also, this is a product of, again, this sort of separate spheres, that family and family life and marriage and the responsibility for kids and those sorts of things, they're generally considered a private realm. And it's just not seen as a place where government is likely to get involved. Now, government does get involved, and you'll see this in the chapter, but it's usually when there's some sort of conflict that develops between parties, and that a dispute needs to be settled, right? Uh, and so it's only when controversy arises that the government will get involved. And that controversy could also be like a crime, like assault, or just absolutely not taking care of your kids, or having no responsibility for the care of your spouse. But besides that, it's kind of like not really seen as the matter of government, thus sort of like letting marriage and family sort of be more governed by traditions and stereotypes and social norms than be actually like regulated by a state. So, what is marriage, and how has society sort of thought about and defined marriage? Well, there's several different ways that societies have thought about marriage. One way they think about it, that they consider marriage to be sort of a religious covenant. That is, that you aren't just making a vow to one person to another person, but that you too are making that vow together before God and before your religious community. And it's a promise that you're making not to the state, some sort of legal contract, but rather it is a promise that you're making to abide by the precepts and principles of your religion. And so when you think about marriage as a religious covenant, it really sort of takes on a very special status within that society. It's seen as a sacrament on par with baptism and with confirmation. And in many ways, it's sort of seen as maybe wholly private in the way that we sort of think about religion as being sort of like an action of your conscience, that you should be sort of free to worship and marry as you see fit, and that the state shouldn't interfere with that. Another way of thinking about marriage that societies have thought about marriage is a contract, a legal contract. But that it is a legal contract not between two people and that wherein the state has some sort of regulation over that, exactly, like sort of telling you what your like legal state responsibilities are, but rather that it's the private party sort of set the terms of the contract, right? And that that how you set those terms is on between two private parties, right? Sort of like the way you might set terms in terms of contracting somebody to do work in your house, right? It would be like two individuals who sit down and they sort of like set up a contract, right? Sort of say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and you promise to do X, Y, and Z. We sign on the dotted line. And the state only gets involved when settling the disputes over the violation of the terms of this private contract. But what you put in the contract is sort of up to the private individuals. Another way of thinking about marriage is that, and this is how we think about marriage today, we, at least when we're talking about it in terms of the contract sense, we think about the legal that marriage is a legal contract, but the government sets the terms. Okay, the government establishes what the rights and responsibilities of marriage are. That's not something that the private individuals set, but as we'll see in a moment, there are specific legal obligations that spouses have to each other. There are certain responsibilities that you have, and also the state sets up certain particular economic benefits of marriage. So one thing I want you to think about is maybe what are the advantages of each of these ways of thinking about marriage? What are some of the drawbacks? And another thing I want you to think about, and this is not as relevant today as it was several years ago, but before marriage was a legal right of all individuals, heterosexual and same sex couples, there was a thinking of sort of decoupling marriage as a religious covenant from the legal contract, right? And so you could say, look, if your religion tells you to believe these certain things, and in your religion it says that marriage is only between a man and a woman, you can have that because marriage is a religious covenant. But marriage is also this legal government where the state gets involved in defining what those terms are and who's eligible to be married. And so, sort of decoupling them was sort of seen as a way of opening the space for legal same sex marriage. It took a decision of the Supreme Court to realize that, but I bring that up because it was in the thinking in terms of how moving forward on same sex marriage, that decoupling was one of the ways of thinking about marriage that we thought was seen as a pathway to equality. What are the current legal rights, responsibilities, and benefits of marriage? Well, let's first take a look at the responsibilities. That in Wisconsin that both spouses have a mutual responsibility to care, protect, and support the other spouse. Now, your textbook points out that usually the state doesn't get involved until it's some extreme circumstance where they use the example in the textbook where somebody had a grave illness and they were sort of left in squalor because their spouse was not, taking financial responsibility for their upkeep and care. But that is that you need to take care of your spouse, and if you fail to provide that protection, that you could be both criminally or civilly liable for it. For example, if I came home and my husband was sitting in his chair, he was having a heart attack, and I was like, good luck with that, buddy. I would be legally responsible. I have a legal responsibility to get protection and care for my husband as he does for me. Hopefully that would never happen, right? But it is an example of that legal responsibility that is set out by the state. Regardless of marriage, that when you give birth to a child, that you are financially responsible for support of that child. That when it comes to property, the state sets out what whose property it is, and we're going to see that was really the Women's Married Women's Property Acts that took place that really sort of moved women more towards an equitable understanding of marriage, property is still an important aspect of marriage today. So in Wisconsin, we are a community property state, and so that if you do divorce, well, any property that you acquired during the course of your marriage, and same with any debt that you acquired that you're liable for during the course of the marriage, that if you divorce, then everything you jointly owned during the course of your marriage can be split 50-50. And if you can demonstrate that, the debt is truly shared liability, then you would be responsible for that as well. So those are just some of the responsibilities that are outlined in Wisconsin state law. Some of the rights and benefits associated with marriage are, when you're married, that the spouse has a right to make medical decisions for you if you are impaired. And so, when before same-sex marriage was legalized, that was a real concern when you had people living together as in a domestic partnership, but not in a legal marriage, and it came to decision making and visitation rights in hospitals, that those couples were denied this right that married people have now because of Obergefell. Then same-sex couples who are married have absolutely the same rights, but you kind of lose sight of just how important those decisions are to couples, particularly in dire circumstances where decisions need to be made quickly. There are also a lot of economic benefits to being married as well, and so there's tax benefits. If you're married, you have the choice of uh, filing your taxes at the married couple rate, and you get a lower rate than if you choose to file separately, or a lower rate than if you're a singleton. You get specific Social Security and employment benefits. And so, under the spousal benefit in Social Security, you may be able to receive Social Security payments worth up to 50% of your spouse's entitlement at their full retirement age. And so, that's a benefit of marriage as well. A benefit that is not shared by somebody who is single, or is not in a legally recognized marriage. That there are a state benefits, so that um, uh, uh, if you own property and you die and you're married, then that estate just goes to your spouse, and you don't have to pay extra taxes on it. That is not the case if you're not legally married. And there are consumer benefits. For example, that married people who are married generally get a lower rate on car insurance, etc. And so those are just some of the rights and economic benefits that come from marriage. I guess a question I want you to think about is, why does the state provide economic incentives for marriage, right? I mean, is it fair that a married couple gets a lower rate when they're doing their federal and state taxes than a singleton, right? What's the state sort of incentive for that? That I guess it's a hassle for the state to dissolve marriages, and so maybe by giving people economic benefits, then they might stay together for a longer period of time and work their problems out. That with Social Security, why couldn't somebody sort of like bequeath their Social Security benefits to somebody who wasn't their spouse, right? But I guess there is this sort of reflection that Social Security benefits are to help the spouse who maybe kind of the unity coverture, sort of thinking about those economic benefits and the long lasting sort of legacy of that. So it's just something to think about. And what are some of the restrictions as it relates to marriage? Well, that if you are legally allowed to get married once you hit 18, but you cannot get married if you want to get married between at 16 or 17. You need to have parental consent, and nobody can get married that who's under the age of 16. But if you look at marriage laws, again, this sort of state by state piecemeal way of doing it, in some states that you can get married well under the age of 16. And so, in some states, you can, um, uh, in Kentucky, the consent of a judge may be needed if somebody is getting married under the age of 13. And in Texas, the marriage is not allowed under the age of 13 for women. So, again, you can kind of like, you might need, judicial consent or parental consent. But if your parents are like, giddy up in Texas, that, you could let 13-year-olds get married. Again, kind of some surprising sort of information. You can't be near relatives in Wisconsin. That means you can't be first cousins. The thinking is that there might be genetic abnormalities that could be passed on if you are close cousins. But if you are sterile and you can prove it, or you're old and you can't reproduce, you can marry your first cousin. And you can be same sex in not just Wisconsin, but in all states of the union. But in Wisconsin, you can't have plural marriages, right? In other words, you can't. A marriage has to be between one human and another human. It can't be between 3 or 4 humans. And so maybe think about what's the thinking behind the. Is it reasonable to limit marriage to 2 people? Why would the state get involved in that? I would imagine they get involved in it because the more people that are involved, the more children that can be produced, and the dissolution of the marriage would be very complicated along the lines too of figuring out sort of like the parents being able to provide support for many, 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 many children might make it dangerous if they're not able to do that, and they would become wards of the state. Anyways, just an overview of policy in Wisconsin as it relates to marriage. All right, the next lecture is going to take a look at the different theories of marriage, and so we can get a sense of sort of the historical context.